here in draft a book, and when he started the research in this institute, he started also to work about the history of the Psalm 137, very important psalm, and he now is also make a lot of research and teaching interest about cultural history of the United States, in particular the study of vernacular music or popular music. His most recent book is No Sympathy for the Devil, Christian Pop Music and the Transformation of American Evangelicalism, a book that I read. Very interesting, yes. And his previous book was How Sweet to Sound, Music in the Spiritual Lives of America's Stowe, was Americans, sorry. And he won the Dean Taylor Award from another book, the first one, Swing Changes, Big Band Jazz in New Deal America, in 1994. Now he started his paper about the soul.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks to everybody for staying around for this long afternoon. It's been a long day. So glad to see some people out there. Unique among the Hebrew Psalms, 137 transpires at a particular time and place. Along with the Exodus, the Babylonian exile to which the psalm refers resides at the core of Judaism. The trauma it entailed served as a crucible, forcing the Israelites to rethink their relationship to Yahweh, revise their understanding of the covenant, reassess their standing as a chosen people, rewrite their history. It inaugurated the Israelite sense of themselves as a nation of exile, a people who have somehow survived living in diaspora for more than 2,500 years. Psalm 137 has also been highly adaptable outside of Judaism. It has served as North America's longest-running protest song, lending rhetorical support to anti-colonial movements from the American Revolution to Jamaican Rastafari. Psalm 137 has also been used to articulate alienation of a more private existential variety. Its three sections have distinct modes of address. They speak to different situations and for different social uses. I want to play a clip to give you a certain sound of the psalm to begin with. This is from the popular series Mad Men, first season.
We'll go right after, right?
Here's the psalm in its entirety. The first four verses, delivered in first person plural, evoke memories of better times, remembered in moments of dislocation, ending with the psalm's famous question. The two middle verses take the form of an inward-looking oath by the psalmist, calling for paralysis of tongue and hand if he forgets Jerusalem. The lines have been of particular interest to political movements that invoke collective memory to mobilize political action. The final verses are addressed to Yahweh, with their call for vengeance climaxing with the infamous dashing of babies against rocks, They have usually been excised in the North American context, even as vengeance has featured prominently in public life, from the earliest conflicts with Native Americans through the triumphant takedown of Osama bin Laden. The first 4 verses are the psalm's best known, favored for innumerable musical settings over the centuries. The location is Mesopotamia, the banks of the Euphrates, or at least one of its irrigation canals. Verb endings indicate the time is past. We sat, we wept, we hanged. They carried us, required of us. The psalm is unambiguous in its historicity. Unlike other laments, we don't have to guess which crisis is being evoked. It can be dated precisely to 587 BCE. But to the psalmist, how distant is that past? The opening lines give the impression of an eyewitness account. Some traditions posit King David as the poet, attributing him prophetic powers. Other traditions credit the psalm to the prophet Jeremiah, who lived through the destruction of the temple, or it could have been created by some unknown contemporary of Jeremiah, or even someone living after the exile. David Noel Friedman alerts us to the verbal music of the psalm. Quote, extensive use of alliteration, this is in Hebrew of course, assonance and similar sound effects to produce a mournful tone in keeping with the content of the psalm. Repeated occurrence of the labials B and M simulate the sound of wind in the willows resonating over the waters. He emphasizes its elaborate symmetry, an envelope construction in which the outer sections fold around the inner ones, producing a cohesive and integrated whole. This formal symmetry reinforces the psalm's thematic symmetry, structured around oppositions: Babylon and Jerusalem, river and rock, silence and singing, forgetting and remembering. It begins and ends with Babylon's topography, first water, then dry rock. The opening and closing sections both feature direct speech, the first from Babylonians, the second from Edomites. A quick historical timeline. Recent years have seen an outpouring of scholarship on the decades of exile. Much of this work emphasizes the split between Gola and Judah, between the irrigation canals of Babylon and templeless Judah. Scholars have forcefully countered the myth of the empty land, the idea that Judah was completely evacuated and barren, its people relocated to Babylon. Also called into question the conventional wisdom that the exile was benign. Based on fragmentary textual evidence, scholars had concluded that after the initial trauma of conquest, the hardships in Babylon were minimal. Recent work, drawing on methodologies from migration studies, refugee studies, diaspora studies, and trauma theory, have emphasized that even under the best circumstances, exile is harrowing. In the realm of popular culture, the first 4 verses have generated by far the most musical settings and visual representations. One version that we heard in Mad Men appears on Don McLean's iconic album of 1971, American Pie. Stephen Schwartz wrote a version of the psalm titled On the Willows for Godspell, also in 1971, but it was a slightly earlier version by the Jamaican group the Melodians that gave the psalm global exposure. First recorded in 1969, featured in the Jimmy Cliff film, The Harder They Come, Rivers of Babylon has since been covered by dozens of artists. The chart-topping 1978 disco version by Boney M sounds as diegetic music in a number of international films, including the Chinese movie Shanghai Dreams and the Kazakh film Tulpan. A short clip from Shanghai Dreams. two verses that comprise the middle section of the psalm register a shift from collective voice to first person singular, from declarative to conditional. They refer back to the psalm's best known verse and suggest an answer. We can read this section as continuing the perspective of those musicians who hung up their harps in verse 2 and hesitated to sing in verse 4. And it shifts from evoking a memory through a vignette of exile to an exhortation to remember. As Yosef Yerushalmi observes, quote, the Hebrew Bible seems to have no hesitations in commanding memory. Its injunctions to remember are unconditional, and even when not commanded, remembrance is always pivotal. And he counts the verb zakar appearing no less than 169 times in the Hebrew Bible. Because of their interest in promoting change in the face of social inertia, champions of causes and movements have been especially drawn to the middle verses. Consider the chorus to a popular song by Matisyahu. Jerusalem, if I forget you, fire not gonna come from me tongue. Jerusalem, if I forget you, let me right hand forget what it's supposed to do. Roughly two and a half centuries earlier, the same lines drew the attention of William Billings, America's first notable composer, who paraphrased Psalm 137 in his anthem against British occupation of Boston. If I forget thee, yea, if I do let my numbers cease to flow, then be my muse unkind, then let my tongue forget to move and ever be confined. Let horrid jargon split the air. For a composer and itinerant teacher of singing schools like Billings, these penalties could hardly be more formidable. 3 generations later, Frederick Douglass became the first American to shift the role of Babylon to the United States themselves, complicit in the crime of slavery. He reminded his Rochester audience that by asking him to speak, they risked replicating the example of Babylon. And he went on, fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous today, are rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them. If I do forget, if I do not faithfully remember those bleeding children of sorrow this day, may my right hand lose its cunning, may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. He quotes the psalm. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. So Douglass formulates the reading of the psalm that has dominated its public meaning ever since, an interpretation that places the U.S. not in the role of Israel or Judah, but Babylon. This reading is echoed in several significant 20th century renditions and musical renditions. The singer Roland Hayes provides the link, a kind of Jackie Robinson of the classical music world. Hayes had a path-breaking career as a concert singer in the 1920s. He toured widely across North America and Europe, performing before royalty and in some of the world's most prestigious concert halls. He inspired Sterling Brown, a leading figure in the New Negro movement of the 1920s, whose first published essay was inspired by an integrated recital at which Hayes performed Dvorak's setting of Psalm 137 as an encore. Hayes and Dvorak also had a formative impact on Paul Robeson. Early in his career, the great singer and actor began working with Hayes' distinguished piano accompanist and arranger, and began singing a similar repertoire of European concert music and spirituals. In an article for Jewish Life magazine, Robeson closed the circle between Douglass, the first American to draw attention to slave spirituals, and Dvorak, who came to our country, studied the melodies and lyrics of Negro song, and drew upon its richness for his own creations, is all a quotation. And so, in this way, the words of this very song, referring to Psalm 137, must have traveled back across the ocean with him. And I am told the song, this setting by Dvorak, was especially popular among the Czech people during their years of suffering under the terror of Nazi occupation. Hayes' example also inspired C.L. Franklin, one of the century's great preachers, who used Psalm 137 as the text for one of his best-known sermons. The upshot of Without a Song is that, yes, the Judeans should have sung. Yes, they were in a strange land, Franklin intoned. Yes, they were among so-called heathens, but even under adverse circumstances, you ought to sing sometimes, and not only sing some of Zion's songs. Franklin's sermon provides examples of enslaved African Americans who dared to sing under such circumstances, including Roland Hayes in Germany after World War I. Many other prominent African American ministers have preached and published sermons based on the Psalm and the exile. Probably none had the impact of a sermon preached by Chicago minister Jeremiah Wright. He begins with the opening stanzas of the Psalm, but chooses to read the exile through Daniel 6. Like Daniel and his 3 fellow captives, he argues, Africans are stripped, first of their names, then of their history and culture. And in many cases, this seems to work, but the Babylonians ultimately overplayed their hand. Quote, you see, they had taken away his history and his name and had called him Belteshazzar. They had taken away his heritage and taught him Babylonian literature, language, and philosophy. But when they tried the ultimate takeaway, when they tried to take away his religion, they did what all oppressors do. They tried to take away his hope. But Daniel had, and here Wright uses a phrase that would resonate in the writings of his best-known parishioner, Barack Obama, but Daniel had the audacity to hope. Memory's imperative remains strong in the final verses, a series of commands to remember, addressed first to Yahweh, then to Babylon. The mode of address shifts from first person to second person imperative. But these lines have virtually no presence in popular culture or in music. It has posed challenges for interpreters for longer than one might expect. Whatever the provocation, few people who encounter the psalm in liturgy or devotional practice appreciate the celebration of violent revenge against children. Many commentators are quick to remind us that the indiscriminate slaughter of non-combatants was the norm in biblical times. The trope of killing babies by dashing them appears at several points in the Hebrew Bible. To be sure, these lines don't actually advocate violence. The sense of crushing injustice suffered by Judah has triggered violent rage, according to many contemporary Christian interpretations, which may be preferable to articulate than to suppress. The theological consensus seems to be to acknowledge this anger, but then to submit that anger to God rather than enact it. In view of the virtually taboo nature of the final 3 verses, which communities actually include them? Well, Augustine offered one strategy, interpreting the psalm as an allegory of Christian piety. What are the little ones of Babylon? Evil desires at their birth. So those can and should be dashed against the rock, and the rock is Christ. Nowhere did this interpretive strategy exercise more social impact than in the role of Saint Benedict. Hour by hour, keep careful watch over all you do, aware that God's gaze is upon you wherever you may be. As soon as wrongful thoughts come into your heart, dash them against Christ and disclose them to your spiritual father. Commentators and poets of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, like John Calvin, themselves often in exile and feeling persecuted, were more likely to embrace a literal reading of the Psalm's final lines. Centuries later in New England, Jonathan Edwards adapted a similarly dispassionate tone. Quote, the dashing of the little ones of Babylon against the stones probably was fulfilled in some degrees when Cyrus took the city, but it had its greatest fulfillment afterwards when that prophecy was fulfilled. He continues, they indeed will do God's work and will perform a good work, who shall be God's instruments of the utter overthrow of the Church of Rome with all her superstitions and heathenish ceremonies and other cursed fruits of her spiritual whoredoms, as it were without having any mercy upon them. Isaac Watts, the great creator of Protestant hymnody, deliberately left the psalm out of his influential psalm collection of 1719, but did include it in a book of occasional writings. And he said, quote, this particular psalm could not well be converted into Christianity, and accordingly it appears here in its Jewish form. The vengeance denounced against Babylon in the close of it shall be executed, said a great divine, upon anti-Christian Rome. But he was persuaded the Turks must do it, for Protestant hearts, said he, have too much compassion in them to imbrue their hands in such a bloody and terrible execution. The text poses obvious challenges for Jewish worshippers as well. While Christian readings of the psalm have tended to be personal and allegorical, Jews have traditionally given it a more political and material interpretation. In Orthodox Ashkenazi communities, the entire psalm is recited in full on weekdays, just before the blessing for food. Orthodox Sephardic communities recite it as part of the Tisha B'Av liturgy that commemorates the destruction of the first and second temples. Sometimes the exile is fused in ritual with the Exodus, as in this Tisha B'Av litany. Any discussion of the modern Jewish relationship to Psalm 137 should consider its resonances during the Holocaust, the most horrific in a series of traumas that began with the Babylonian conquest. Nazi concentration camps witnessed numerous examples of Jews being taunted and coerced to sing and dance. Typically, they sponsored bands and orchestras to play for inmates on their way to work details or the gas chambers, or to entertain visiting Nazi dignitaries. To return to the original context of the psalm in the Hebrew Bible, given the vengeance foreshadowed in the final verses, was any vengeance actually perpetrated? The Bible is silent on this point. Surprisingly little comment has been made regarding the one population that seems to bear the brunt of a Judean reprisal, the Gentile wives and children of the exiles. They are divorced as part of renewing of the covenant. Subtle gender overtones inflect the Hebrew of Psalm 137. The imperative attributed to the Edomites as direct speech, destroy her, raise her, is sometimes rendered strip her, or lay bare. The Hebrew aru, repeated twice, shares a feminine suffix. It can be translated make nakedness seen, and is even used as a euphemism for sexual intercourse. And the Hebrew word for foundations has a secondary meaning of buttocks. In short, Jerusalem is depicted as a woman being sexually humiliated, which brings us full circle back to the Manhattan milieu of Mad Men. The undercurrent of misogyny and sexual harassment in that program may be what sets the world of that series apart from the professional world of our own, at least hopefully so. As the folk musicians play Waters of Babylon in the scene we saw, we watch scenes out of Draper's internal flow of consciousness. The song and scene invite us to feel we are watching Babylon with its wealth, power, and sexual corruption, but with the knowledge that a cultural tsunami, the 60s, is gathering force. As a destruction of Jerusalem is thought to have spurred a rethinking of Hebrew scripture and the meaning of the history it narrates, we might consider whether Mad Men offers a self-reflective backward glance from the 21st century to an earlier, seemingly more innocent era, the new frontier of the early 60s. In which case, a popular song based on Psalm 137 would represent an exceptionally fitting choice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very interesting paper about this test, also that have so many meaning, so many, I don't know, the term in Italian is ricadutas, really have, it's interesting, your analysis line by line to see how in the popular culture has been used this very important psalm. It's the second paper about psalm today, and it's interesting also to look to see how this very old text, sacred or not, continue to make us discuss. So I think there are. We know we are tired, but I think there are questions.
Yeah, Owen.
Thanks, that was really interesting. Do you ever get the impression that sometimes the vengeance, the violence in the last things is sort of left silent but implied? So I'm thinking, for example, of there's sort of some traditions of kind of, I'm thinking maybe African American music, where they might be attempting to communicate ideas about that violence and vengeance or reparations in some way by kind of referencing a text that people would know, but only singing the lines of the sort of, you know, the how shall we sing a song, expecting an audience to kind of understand that there's another part, a counterpart, which has this vengeance.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. I haven't come across those readings or evidence that that's the case, but it seems plausible that it might function that way, given that so many people using this psalm in worship or liturgy would be aware of the final verse. And, you know, in fact, people usually say, oh, that's the psalm with that horrible last verse. And so, yeah, I can imagine contexts where that might happen, but I haven't come across that suggestion before.
Other questions?
So it's not a question at all. It's just a little information or addition. Do you know about the scandal when it was found out that Bonnie M in the recordings didn't act? There was only one female singer who sang all female voices, and the male voices were sung by the manager.
Oh, true. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised that there would be revelations about Boney M, but I hadn't heard that one quite before. Is nothing sacred? or they had a very talented manager. Well,
but did you see? It's this psalm is a flag for Afro-American movement over the time. But there are now some in hip-hop culture, some movement anti-Semitic, and did you had the occasion to meet something I don't know, controversial about the use of?
Not really. I mean, the Matisyahu example, and of course he's a strong Zionist, and I saw him perform that song, Jerusalem, and it seemed to be his most popular song. You know, it's interesting the kind of resonance of destruction and vengeance, just actually since I did the work on this paper in terms of Gaza and the Middle East, a kind of fresh reminder of, you know, the endless cycles of violence and revenge that, you know, stretch back millennia. But no, not in hip hop. And I'm sure it's out there. I'm sure it's perhaps not directly deploying the psalm, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yes, who is Babylonia?
Yeah.
Okay, I think